Escapes, Chapter 24, The Bluff. The cows peered out from behind the barn at Roz, and the robot was holding the rifle. She carried it to the far side of the pasture and placed it by her feet. Then she began coating herself with mud and grass and probably a little cow dung. Every inch of her body was concealed. She was nestled down into the ground and became part of the landscape, an ordinary clump of grass. The cows were stunned. What's Roz doing? Is she all right? Where did she go? Roz had learned to camouflage herself back on the island, and now she was using that trick once again. She sat motionless for hours, waiting for the wolves to appear. Daylight faded, the stars came out, the moon climbed into the sky, but the wolves didn't show. So Roz tried something new. The robot was an excellent mimic, and she began crying out in a sad voice of a wounded calf. "Please help me," she cried. "I've hurt my leg and I cannot move." Crickets chirped, "Help me." An owl hooted, "I cannot move." The calf's voice continued crying out. Finally, as the moon dipped behind the trees, 7 wolves slunk into the pasture. Shadow led the way and silently stalked through the night. He was covered in fur, practically invisible. Only his long pale scar gave him away. Noses sniffed and eyes searched and ears listened. Then a clump of grass began to rustle. "There," whispered Shadow. "The calf is hiding in the tall grass." "Something feels wrong to me, Shadow," said the female wolf. "This is too easy." "I make the decisions, Barb," snapped the wolf leader. "Slash, lurk, fang, circle around and wait for my signal." The 3 wolves dashed off. When they were in position, Shadow gave the signal, and his pack closed in on the wounded calf. With each step, the grass rustled more and more until the ground seemed to be moving. And then the ground really was moving. Grass and dirt crumbled aside, and there was our robot standing tall, pointing a rifle at the leader of the pack. The whole pack froze. "Hello, Shadow," growled the robot. "My name is Roz, and I see from your scar that you're familiar with rifles. You have been shot before. You know what will happen if I pull this trigger." Reader, you and I are well aware that our robot was not programmed to be violent. Roz couldn't have pulled the trigger if she wanted to, but she didn't want to. She was bluffing. Of course, Shadow didn't know any of this. As far as the wolf knew, he was defeated. And so he did what wolves do when they're defeated. He lay down and he cowered before the robot. For the first time anyone could recall, the wolf leader looked weak. "I do not want you to hurt any wolves." I do not want to hurt any wolves, Roz continued. "But if you return to this farm, I will have no choice. Now please leave and never come back." Shadow scrambled away with his tail between his legs. Barb was close behind him, followed by the other wolves, and soon the entire pack disappeared into the night. Chapter 25, The Summer. Spring melted into summer, and the wolves were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps Roz had scared off the pack for good, or perhaps the heat was keeping them away. You see, it was the hottest time of year on the farm. The sun was scorching, the fields were baking, and the ponds were drying up, and foul odors were floating all throughout the dairy farm. During dry spells, the farm's powerful sprayers were activated. Water shot out in long, misty arcs and landed and in the land turned to in those lands the grass turned deeper shades of green. When the hay fields were lush and ready to be harvested, Roz fired up the mower and the baler. The giant machines rolled out of the shed and down the long driveway. Shortly afterward, they rolled back, leaving bales of hay strewn across the stubbly fields. The cows and the humans spent hot days indoors. Only when the sun set and the air began to cool would they venture outside. The herd strolled out into the grass to graze under the stars, and the children ran to chase fireflies. Sometimes Mr. Sharif even stepped out to stretch his stiff legs. Trees swished in the evening breeze, heat lightning flickered across the horizons. Katydids sang their summer songs. When Roz wasn't farming, she was searching for ways to escape. Everything hinged on the children. The robot needed their help, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth. It was just still too risky. Mr. Sharif asked the children not to distract Roz from her work, but they did anyways. They'd sneak out of the house and order the robot to play with them. Together, they told stories and rode bicycles. They laid in the grass and watched the puffy clouds drip by. Summer was tornado season. On occasion, thick clouds would start to funnel down, reaching toward the ground. So far, the funnel clouds had receded back to the sky before doing any damage, but it was only a matter of time before a real tornado touched down. Chapter 26. The Tornado. The weather forecast warned of possible tornadoes that day, but despite their scientific equipment, experts still couldn't predict exactly when or where the tornadoes would strike. So, most farmers carried on with their usual tasks while keeping a watchful eye on the skies. Roz was out in the fields loading hay bales into the flatbed truck as the towering, puffy clouds rose up from the south. Raindrops slightly tapped on her body, and she thought nothing of it. The wind began to blow, and still the robot continued to work. It wasn't until the first flash of lightning that Roz finally called it quits. She climbed into the back of the truck, and it automatically rolled across the hayfield down toward the driveway. The storm developed quickly. Dark clouds started whirling and bulging downward, lowering and lowering like giant, twisting fingers pointing across the countryside. A tornado was beginning to form. When the truck reached the driveway, Roz hollered, "Drive faster!" The engine revved and the tires kicked up the gravel, and the robot held on tight. The funnel cloud continued stretching downward. It brushed the tree line and the leaves exploded into the air. Dust whirled around, rising higher with each spin. Then the tornado touched the ground. Sirens sounded in the distance, but the tornado was growing noisier and angrier as it blew from the fields, and the siren was quickly lost in howling winds. The truck charged up the driveway and into a cluster of farm buildings. Roz looked ahead at the house and saw frightened faces behind the windows. "Go to the storm cellar," she hollered in her loudest voice. Then she leaped off the truck and ran to help the Sharifs. Leaves and sticks flew sideways, whipping against the robot's body, knocking her off balance. Behind her, the farm buildings rattled and groaned. The milking parlor was shaking violently. With a long, terrible screech, its entire roof was peeled off and it sailed away in the wind. 4 blurry faces appeared in the backyard. Mr. Sharif shielded his face and hobbled alongside the house toward the storm cellar. He threw open the door and waved everyone downstairs. Oscar went first, then Jaya, but Jad wasn't moving. "Come on, Jad," yelled his father. The boy stood still, shaggy hair flying everywhere. He stared up at the towering, twisting tornado. He used to have nightmares about tornadoes, but this was no nightmare. This was real, and it was getting closer. The wind swirled faster, and the winds roared louder. The trees bent down to the ground. Suddenly, Jad felt strong arms around him, and Roz whisked him to safety. Mr. Sharif reached up from inside the shelter, desperately grasping for his son. And just when Roz thrust the boy into the father's arm, a blast of wind slammed the cellar doors shut and closed and swept our robot away. At first, Roz didn't realize she was in the tornado. She kept expecting to fall back to the ground, but the wind only lifted her higher and higher. She saw tree tops and rooftops and faraway fields. More of the countryside came into view with each spin of the funnel cloud. Our robot's survival instincts were blaring inside of her head, telling her to protect herself. But what could she do? The tornado was in control. The winds whirled her up and around and up and around. Roz could almost imagine what it was like to fly. And then she thought of Brightville, and it seemed that her final moments would be spent in her son's airborne world. Roz wasn't the only thing being swept away in the storm. Dust, gravel, leaves, and branches and fence posts and farm equipment were all swirling around her. The robot was pelted by flying objects, big and small. She never even saw the shovel coming. The heavy tool wheeled around the tornado. Clank! It hit the back of her head. Everything suddenly went dark. while Roz was still.